Are we live? Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event. And our speaker will be introduced by Dean Joel Hellman, Dean of School of Foreign Service.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here live and in person for those of you who are here with us. Welcome everyone who is online as well, but we really wanted to take the opportunity. And I was quite keen to see my dear old friend, Tim Frye. So we did this as a hybrid event, and I'm glad to have people both here and online. I have to say, on a personal note, I'm feeling very old today. And one of the reasons why I'm feeling very old is because I went to graduate school attracted by a man named Marshall Shulman. I don't know if any of the students here or online know the name Marshall Shulman, but at the time he really was the Dean of Soviet Foreign Policy Specialists. And again, I'm dating myself because I went to graduate school to study something called the Soviet. And I was attracted to Columbia University. It had some of the great figures in Soviet studies at the time, Marshall Shulman, Robert Legels, Baron Galler. And I went to graduate school there, and I ended up actually teaching for a short time at Columbia University. And one of my star students was a young man named Tim Frye. And Tim Frye is now Marshall Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at, I think, the nation's premier place to study. I love SFS dearly, but has always for years been with one of the premier venues for studying not only the Soviet Union, but the post-Soviet space. So Tim has been a leader of the Harriman Institute. He's been a director of the Harriman Institute. He's also been chairman of the Department of Science at Columbia University. He also now currently co-directs the International Center for the Study of Institutions and Development at the Higher Economics in Moscow, and he edits post-Soviet affairs. So from his student days to now an established leader in the field of post-Soviet studies, it's just been a thrill and an honor to see the extraordinary rise of the career professor. Tim Frye, who started with a BA in language and literature at Middlebury, then went through Columbia's graduate program. His areas of expertise are in comparative politics and political economy, on Russia and Eurasia, but he teaches on a whole range of fields on autocracy, corruption, economic development. His books, 4 books, from one that I know extremely well, from his dissertation, Brokers and Bureaucrats, Building Markets in Russia, but several books on essentially the process of the interaction between politics and economics and Soviet space and building markets. And what we thought might be a democracy turns out to be much less of a democracy, and ends up with his current book, Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Russia. So it's really wonderful to welcome Professor Frye here and to hear about his latest book. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Tim.
Thank you very much. Marshall Shulman once had a similarly overgenerous introduction, and he said, my mother would have loved it, my father would have believed it. So thanks everybody for coming. It's really great to be in person. Having just sat through a Zoom meeting on faculty, I'm reminded of the joys of online education. So it's great to be here in front of a live audience and to be in front of an online audience as well. So after Russia annexed Ukraine in March 2014, 2 political scientists did a survey of Americans and asked them to find Ukraine on a map. Only 1 in 6 Americans could do so. We all know Americans are bad at geography, it's not a big deal. But they also found that those Americans who could least find Ukraine on a map were most likely to support US intervention in the conflict with Russia. So this suggests that we got a lot of work to do on our great public debate on what to do about Russia. So the simplest way to describe my new book, Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia, is that it's an explainer book. It translates the best academic research we have on a host of interesting questions about Russia. Is Putin popular? How do elections work? Is corruption as bad as they say? Can Russians really manipulate elections abroad and get the outcomes they want? The book should have something for you, whether you're a Russia expert or whether you're just Russia curious. But it's really written for a non-specialist audience. It's jargon-free and it's even got jokes in it. So I hope you'll enjoy reading it more than a lot of the other academic books you might be reading. Now, there's no shortage of books on Russia. Right? So a real challenge is trying to write a book about Russia that departs from the existing literature in some way. And I think this book does in 3 ways. Let me lay those out, and I'll really look forward to hearing your questions. I'll go for about 20 minutes. The first departure is that I critique 2 of the most common ways that people think about Russia and write about Russia and talk about Russia. So one I'll call the Putinology view, and this view kind of reduces Russian politics to trying to understand Vladimir Putin's worldview and background. And the second is what I'll call the exceptional Russia view. And I think I can illustrate them by thinking of the case of Yukos. Many of you will know the background of the story. In 2003, the Kremlin brings charges against Mikhail Khodorkovsky, at the time the richest man in Russia, sees this as an asset of Yukos. And the general explanations for this came in 2 flavors. One said, well, look, Putin was a KGB man. The Siloviki forgot to get rich or were unable to get rich in the 1990s. And this is simply the revanche of the Siloviki and Putin's coterie of former KGB offers. And that this view suggests that the way Russia is the way it is because that is the way Putin is. Another view said, no, look, this is just another example of the historic fusion of state and private property in Russia. This goes back decades. And this view suggests we view Russian politics through the lens of its unique history and culture. And that in this extreme view, it says Russians are so shaped by the Tsar's past and the recent Soviet past that they have a unique set of cultures and values. Right? So the problem with these 2 point of views is that there were similar expropriations of energy companies around the same time in Algeria, Bolivia, Chad, Dubai, Ecuador, Senegal, and Venezuela. So this suggests that it's not anything necessarily to do with Vladimir Putin's personality or his KGB background or Russia's unique history, but it is a much more general problem. And we see a nice study by Sergei Guriev and some of his co-authors, which shows from 1960 to 2006, when oil prices go up in autocratic regimes, the likelihood of nationalization increases dramatically. Right? So rather than treat Russia's politics or Vladimir Putin's personality as something unique, I argue we should think about Russia as a personalist autocracy. Right? This is a specific type of autocratic government that's dominated by a single individual, where major policy and personnel decisions really lie in the hands of one person, rather than in the military as an organization or a political party, as we see in China or as we saw in the Soviet Union. So throughout the book, I show how Russia's politics follow patterns that we see in other personalist autocracies like Erdogan's Turkey, Chavez's Venezuela, Orban's Hungary, Nazarbayev's Kazakhstan, and others. And leaders in these personalist autocracies rule by a mixture of good performance, personal charisma, popularity, propaganda, and they try to avoid repression as largely counterproductive. But they face this real deep problem that they can be thrown out of office in 2 ways, right? They could be thrown out by a coup by their inner circle, or they could be thrown out by mass protest. And the difficult problem is that it's really difficult to resolve both of these problems at the same time. Typically, resolving one makes the other one worse. So we find that rulers in these personalist autocracies face really difficult trade-offs, and that's what makes the study of Russian politics, to my mind, so fascinating. Leaders like Putin, they need to cheat to win elections, but not so much that they signal weakness. They use anti-Westernism to rile the base, but not so much that they provoke war. They'll use corruption to reward cronies, but not so much that the economy collapses and sparks mass protests. They need to manipulate the news, but not so much that people turn off the television. They repress political opponents, but not so much that there's a popular backlash. They keep the security services strong, but not so strong that they can turn against you. So this suggests a kind of very different view of Russian politics, that Vladimir Putin is not all powerful, despite the fact that there is very little or no at this point now open political challenger to Vladimir Putin. And that this kind of great man view of Russian politics that the Kremlin so loves to put out there is really not capturing what's at the core of the regime. Right? Moreover, cross-national research shows that personalist autocracies like Putin's Russia, they tend to be more corrupt, they have more volatile policies, and they tend to be more repressive than either one party or military regimes. Right? And these are themes, I think, that have been really redolent in all the, particularly in recent years, discussion about Russian politics, right? So in this way, I think this book takes on a very different view than most debates about Russia. And it's not to say that Putin's personality is not important or that Russian history doesn't matter. That's clearly not the case. It is to say, though, that we need to open up our view and think about Russia as an example of a personalist autocracy that sheds light on Russia that we don't normally see. Okay, so that's one way it's different. Second way it's different is that I translate a lot of cutting-edge social science research on Russia. And this highlights a lot of research by a new generation of scholars, most of whom were trained after the fall of the Berlin War, many of whom are Russian, many of whom are based in Russia. And it's really not well recognized, but Russia's been a great place to study autocracy in the last 20 years. It's obviously quite difficult to study autocracy. It's easier to study democracy. But relative to other autocracies, Russia is really a great place. Right? You can do public opinion research, rather high quality public opinion research in ways that would be impossible in many other autocracies. You've got a highly educated populace. You've got lots of domestic human capital, many of whom have been well trained now in social science methods in a way that they weren't in the Soviet period. And if you look at the top journals in political science, works on Russia are really prominently featured. You know, far more so than any time in my lifetime. You know, when you open up the top journals, there are articles on Russia because people are interested in autocracy, and Russia's a great place to study it. So if you read in the book, you'll see how my colleagues and I conduct surveys to try to figure out whether or not people are lying when they answer the question about Putin's approval ratings. How we use Russian electoral data to detect fraud. How we use big data to find political and economic ties among Russian elites. How we identify bots on Twitter to track propaganda campaigns and follow the Kremlin's efforts to manipulate public opinion and interfere in foreign elections. You'll even learn how one scholar tracked graffiti in downtown Moscow and showed how the Kremlin co-opted opposition-oriented graffiti artists by giving them prime space in downtown Moscow, and how they pushed out the more hardline opposition graffiti artists to the outskirts of Moscow in a really subtle strategy that you know, kind of one would not have thought of themselves without really having a good knowledge of social science and knowing a lot about Russia. I think one of the things that makes this new generation of scholars studying Russia, I think, so productive is that not only are they well trained in social science, but they have a lot of experience on the ground. Now, unfortunately, this research has had next to zero impact on our public debate about Russia. So this is what the book really tries to do, to bring this research out for a general interest audience. Now, also, I think Russia hands will learn from it as well. I know I have trouble keeping up with the political science research in my own field, let alone try to keep up with what's going on in adjacent fields. So I'm hoping that other Russia hands in history or sociology or economics would also take an interest in the book. So the third way that the book, I think, is different from a lot of other books on Russia is that it includes a lot of personal anecdotes of my various adventures and misadventures in Russia over the last 30 plus years. I describe in the book what it was like to work for the US Information Agency on a cultural exhibit in the late 1980s, where 8,000 Soviet citizens came up to our stands every day and asked us questions about life in the United States. It was the best job I'll ever have. I've got a good job now, but at 24, that was to be in the Soviet Union at that historic moment was really remarkable. I described what it was like being the inadvertent target of a honey trap by the KGB in the late Soviet Union, what it was like to witness the 9/11 attacks from a Moscow bar called Uncle Sam's. And I described what it was like to work at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Russia in the 1990s, and now to head this research center at the Higher School of Economics over the last decade. And I think these anecdotes, they make the book a better read. Some of them are funny, I hope. And but they also give insights into Russia that I don't think one would get unless you spend a lot of time on the ground. So one of my favorite experiences as an exhibit guide was in DC, where a young man came up to my stand and he said, you have unemployment in your country. I said, yes. And he said, that's bad. I said, that's really bad. We don't have that here. I said, okay. And he said, but I also understand that you have something called the want ads. So how can both of these things be true? How can you have unemployment? And how can you also have at the same time employers looking for people to work? And I think this was a really kind of insightful take, in that he knew he was getting some propaganda from the Russian government, and that there was some mixture of truth and untruth in what he was being fed. But he was really trying to figure out, how could both of these things be true? Another example came from Irkutsk, where a young woman came up to my stand and started asking me questions about US policy in the Middle East. I fumbled over the answers, and she really lit into me even harder. I stumbled a little bit more, and I tried to explain US foreign policy and to explain my personal views. And it's a pretty delicate and complicated subject. And she lit into me again. And finally, the crowd turned to her and said, they've prepared you very well, meaning that they had, she'd been sent by whatever local authorities to try to embarrass us. And to see the Russian crowd take my side rather than her side kind of demonstrated the agency, that Russians had in this back and forth that we would have every day on the stand. And one final anecdote comes from viewing the 9/11 attacks from Moscow, where I was in town for a conference, and I was interviewing a banker at Jajja Sam's, just off Mayakovsky Square, небезызвестное место back in the day. And the TV stopped whatever they were broadcasting and showed events from New York, and we were both really struck. But it didn't really hit until a few days later, when I went to the US Embassy and walked past it, and there was just this mound of flowers and testimonials about Russia's experience with recent terror attacks, about World War II, and how this was a sneak attack against civilized countries, and that we had to band together. And it was really touching. And I really kind of broke down. That was when it really hit me, just how deep this attack was. A couple of days later, I went to the Russian Central Bank, and I was interviewing someone there. And he said, immediately, how sorry he was about the attacks, how the US and Russia needed to ally against this terror, how civilized countries like Russia and the United States, could defeat this enemy arm in arm, and that this is expressed this great, sense of empathy. And as he finished, he said, well, but you did want to be the only superpower, right? So I kind of got that sense of just how deep, the itch, to need to scratch that itch of, being a fallen superpower, and how, that just comes out in all kinds of unusual and interesting ways. So just to wrap up, in writing the book, I've learned the definition of eternity. Eternity is the time from when you hit send on the final proofs to the point where the book actually appears. The page proofs went out in December. Alexei Navalny was still in Germany. So a lot's happened since then. And but I think the analysis largely holds up. One key point in the book is that as Putin's popularity has stumbled, as propaganda has become less effective, as the economy has slowed down, it's become much more difficult for Putin to rely on these kind of rather easy ways to legitimate his rule, and has had to rely much more on repression and coercion. And although I didn't anticipate that turn being so deep and so fast, I did think I got the direction right. So thank you very much, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that very engaging introduction to your book. And I should say also that I got this copy. Well, first of all, I should say that I'm Michael David Fox. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian Russian European Studies here at Georgetown. I got this right when it came out, and I read it, and it's a great read, and I learned a lot from it. And I'm more than Russia curious, by the way. So I'm going to moderate our discussion. We have a good 35 minutes to talk. And we also have an online audience. You can use the Q&A function in the webinar, ask your questions, and I will get to them hopefully after a few questions from the room itself. But let me get us started with the first question. And by the way, I remember, when you said Uncle Sam, I didn't remember when I read the book, but when you said Dad Sam, I did remember that, because we used to go there before the burger craze hit Moscow. It was the only place you could get a decent burger, right? But then now everyone has craft burgers. And so my question is about two words in the title. The first one is weak, and the second one is power. So I know you've gotten this question before, but it's a little different twist. But weak strongman. What sense weak? In the introduction, in the conclusion, I believe you say it's because it's not only because of these limits and constraints, but it's because many of the decisions ultimately, despite Putin's dominance in domestic politics, lead to weaker institutions, weaker economy, and poor decision making. But isn't that intrinsic to all or most autocrats in the world, like Erdogan, Orban, Chavez? I mean, maybe Orban might be a partial exception, but very dependent on EU money. But is there such a thing as a strong man in today's world? And connected to that is the question about power, because so much of what you're doing here is sort of quantifying the limits, but power is also about perceptions, right? And if everyone believes Putin is extremely strong, so much so that you have to write this book to refute it, doesn't he have, I mean, for example, the KGB archives opened in Kiev, and we now know that the KGB had manpower problems, financial problems, there was a lot of chaos, but the projection of a fearsome image was incredibly successful. So where does the perceptions of power play into your equation?
Great, thanks a lot. Two great questions. So the title of the book, Weak Strongman, was something I struggled with a lot. The The press really liked the title. They thought it was punchy and strong, and you could remember it. And they made clear to me that a book title that was more accurate to the nuanced text of the sort of constrained strongman was probably not going to work, right? So I think the text is a lot more nuanced than the title. It's not really a kind of an analytic category that says these leaders are strong men, these leaders are weak strong men. It's more a notion that I think in the our discussion about Russia, we tend to think of Putin as all powerful and omnipotent, and we underestimate the difficulty of ruling a country with 11 time zones, with a bureaucracy that is rife with corruption, with interest groups that don't always agree with each other, and force Putin to have to resolve disputes in a way that he might not always like. So in this way, it's more of a reference to consider the limits and the constraints on even a leader as powerful as Putin. And it's also an attempt to kind of push back against the kind of great man view of Russian politics that I think pervades a lot of our discussion in the US. And it's also something that the Kremlin really likes, the Kremlin really tries to promote. So it is an attempt to just push back against this view that because Putin faces no open political challenger, he's just able to get what he wants in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. And I think in the book, I try to show that no, he faces all of these constraints, and that's a kind of more productive way to think about Putin's role in this broader political system, and that just kind of putting Putin on the couch doesn't get us very far. So on the power is the perception of power, and the Kremlin works really hard to project this image of Putin as a powerful leader. We all know the shirtless photos and the propaganda efforts. So obviously that is part of the story. But one of the points I also make in the book is that there's a lot of agency within the Russian society. They don't always buy the line that Putin is this all-powerful actor. For example, the Kremlin's been trying to get the oligarchs to bring their capital back to Russia for a long time. They're not always successful in doing that. The Kremlin has been trying to shift blame for poor economic performance on the EU and on the US. And if you look at public opinion surveys, they're not very successful in that. If you look at public opinion, even as a constraint in foreign policy, where we know that leaders have a lot more authority in foreign policy than they do in domestic policy. So that was a difficult chapter to write, and in some ways is the really hardest test of the argument. But even there, the Kremlin seems very averse to putting Russian soldiers in harm's way. So even the intervention in Syria, which of course took place after it was clear the US was not going to have boots on the ground in large numbers, the Kremlin has tried to keep a light footprint to reduce the numbers of Russian casualties. And even in eastern Ukraine, they're still denying that there's any Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine, in part because you look at public opinion in Russia, support for kind of open and intervention that would lead to higher body counts is really very low, right? So even there, we can see that public opinion, even in foreign policy, even on these issues of real importance, I think you can say that even there is some constraint.
All right, the floor is now open to questions, and I'll just ask you to identify yourself before you speak. Yes, please.
Hi, Tim, PhD student in CP here. I was wondering if you had a comment. This is very nerdy, but there's been a bunch of authors, Barbara Geddes and Jennifer Gandhi, coming out with these metrics of personalism. to these big cross-national studies. And there's a new Chinese team that's doing it with like natural language processing. I guess I was wondering if you think those are any good, or what do you think about them, or what do you think is like the right way to measure like the leaders' questing power?
So I've seen some of that work in early stages, Jen Gandhi's work in particular, and it's the obvious next step to think about personalism as a category. So obviously, autocracies are a very heterogeneous group. We made this first cut to say, look, there are military-led, party-led, and personalist regimes, and they all kind of have their own logics, and the way power is transferred in these regimes differs quite a bit. But personalist autocracies is still a really broad group, right? So we need to come up with different metrics for how personalist these regimes are, and that's difficult, to do. So some of the things they look at are formal and informal appointment powers, and it's difficult to measure informal powers, but that is one area where, in particular, I think, is kind of the way to go. It's kind of some of the best measures to look at these kinds of informal appointment powers, particularly when there's turnovers in government. Like you can look at does the new leader come in and just wipe out or replace the whole team, or are there stalwarts that are able to stay over, which suggests that personalism might be lower. So a lot of work to be done. Big dissertation topic if you're interested.
Other questions?
Yeah, thank you. Elton Skandai, teaching the democracy and governance. So I was curious in terms of the personalistic autocracy part of it, because at a time when the government doesn't have as much oil largesse to spread, you're saying repression is up. What do you think? I mean, but at the same time, the opposition is divided. What are the prospects for democratization in Russia?
So good point. So one point I want to make in the book is that it's not a prediction that Putin will lose power, right? So the notion is that personalist autocrats have all of these different tools: popularity, various kinds of performance legitimacy, economic growth, foreign policy success. They have propaganda, and those are the tools they would prefer to rely on. And Putin was able to do that. You had, as Andy Cutchins likes to say, you had Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Vladimir the Lucky, right? He comes into power just when oil prices are surging, when the ruble's been devalued, so the exports are more competitive, and the hard work of building the market economy in the 1990s has already been done. You had the annexation of Crimea, but those kinds of victories are just harder and harder to come by. So as these other tools of legitimating his rule become much more blunt, the turn is generally towards repression. Now, one thing I didn't anticipate was that the opposition, particularly Navalny's led opposition, would be wiped out so quickly. I think that caught a lot of observers by surprise. So the organized opposition has been eliminated, but that doesn't mean opposition has been eliminated. This turn to repression, it's not going to reduce corruption. It's not going to spark growth. It's not going to increase trust in government. If anything, it's going to make those problems worse. And it's hard to dial back repression and coercion. But on the other hand, leaders can stay in power for a long period of time, on a heavy dose, using a heavy dose of coercion and repression, as long as the economy doesn't collapse. And there's no real evidence that the economy is going to collapse anytime until the early 2030s, as Thane Gustafson lets us know in his new book. Right. So the point I want to make in the book is not that Putin is going to lose power and be replaced by Democrats, but that the task of governing Russia is getting more and more difficult. And one of the point I make in the end of the book is that Russia's an interesting case for democratization because personalist autocracies tend to be the worst form of government for being replaced by a more liberal, open democratic government. It's much more likely under a one-party or a military-led regime. So that's the real bad news. On the other hand, it's an unusually well-educated autocracy. It's pretty well off. It's pretty ethnically homogeneous. So on those other factors that we often think about as conducive to democracy, Russia doesn't do terribly badly. So the notion that it's all doom and gloom, it's kind of offset by these other factors that offer a more kind of positive outlook. So going forward, we have a nice test of these two competing theories about what will happen in Russia in the future.
Hi, Kathleen Smith, series. I wanted to ask you about the idea that it's a good time to study Russia. I would really like this to be true. I want to join you on that belief, but I wonder about it in part because it seems to me that there's a big trend right now that's disincentivizing people to work with foreigners. That survey researchers don't want to take American money anymore. The latest attack on the director of the Shaninka, what's happening with Memorial this month. Is it not getting harder in some ways?
It's getting much harder.
What do we do
Yes,
about that?
yes, it is getting much harder. And we've had this great renaissance in the study of Russia over the last 20 years. I think that's in political science. I think that's certainly the case. Going forward, I think it's just going to be much more difficult. There's some great work being done in historical political economy related to Russia. Really interesting work on serfdom, on peasant revolts. This is all really exciting. There's tons of survey data over the last 20 years, 30 years. When you talk with colleagues working on Africa or the Middle East, and you say, so we have this data set of monthly presidential approval ratings going back to the early 1990s, and we have it from more than one company. They're just like, are you kidding me? This is just an embarrassment of riches. There's lots of administrative data that's waiting to be mined. But what we're really missing, and I think I'm really worried we're going to be missing, is the kind of deep ethnographic research where people could go out to the regions and have really soak and poke for months on end. That seems to be increasingly difficult. There are still incentives on the Russian side to raise the international rankings of institutions like the Higher School of Economics. Whether that is a powerful enough inducement to continue the success that it's had over the last 20 years is under doubt. There's no doubt about that. There'll be more people going into foreign policy studies, I think. So that will be an area that's ripe for, and actually that would be a necessary balancing effect, because over the last 20 years, much of the research has been on the domestic politics side rather than on the foreign policy side. But there's no doubt it's getting more difficult. On the other hand, Russia's a tremendously interesting place. There's a lot of interest in autocracy. Russian foreign policy is an issue that we're going to be dealing with for as long as there's a Russia. 11 time zones, nuclear weapons, seat on the United Nations. It's not going away. So it's hard. It's always been hard in some ways, but not everybody needs to study China, right? So there should be there's an equilibrium where you might be better off being that small number of experts on Russia than being the 100th expert on China.
Can I just piggyback on to Kelly Smith's question here? Is that Because I know in the book, I remember you referred to the weakness of foreign policy studies compared to domestic. Is that you're talking about within Russia? Because it's also the case of the US too, right?
Yeah, I was trying to be a little gingerly, you don't want to poke your colleagues, too much. So I have some language about, yes, I do think that, on the foreign policy side, there's just been less human capital devoted to studying Russia over the last 30 years. In the 90s, very few people went into studying Russian foreign policy. I think in recent years that started to change, and some people who study domestic politics have also shifted their attention more to foreign policy. But that is a difficulty. There's also a shift, I think, in international relations to be less of an expert on a particular country and to focus less on grand strategy. Over the last 20 years, international relations was dominated much more by the study of civil war, by kind of transnationalism, international institutions, and less by the meat and potatoes, grand strategy issues that I think have really come to the fore in recent years.
Okay, so I saw another question here, Joe, please.
Hello, Professor Frye. I'm Joe. I'm a first-year MA student here at Series. I was wondering what your opinion would be, looking at the future of Russia. How do you think Putin plans on making a system that survives after him? Because the impression I've got is that the current government in Russia is sort of flying by the seat of its pants and, living year to year. And do you really think there's any sort of strategy on the part of Putin to build a system that survives after him, or no?
Well, one of the things we know from these personalist autocracies is the logic that in order to become a personalist autocrat, you need to usurp power from other institutions like the Duma, the bureaucracy, regional government, and that really means weakening them in a lot of ways because you want to control that power. So that makes transfers of power in these personalist autocracies much more difficult than in one-party regimes or where the leader can retire to the party, a nice post in the party, or to a military-led regime where the generals can go back to the barracks. That makes these transfers of power really difficult because there's no soft landing pad for these autocrats. So we know from the kind of cross-national literature that in the post-war era, about 80% of personalist autocrats, when they lose power, tend to end up in exile, in jail, or to lose their lives in the political struggle, right? So these are not good outcomes for lots of personalist autocrats. Now, it's not to say that that's what's going to happen in Russia. Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan might be a kind of counterexample of somebody who seems to have been able to step down after 29 years in power. So Putin's tenure for the region is about par for the course at this point. But in general, these kinds of transitions of power are really difficult, in part because other institutions have been so weakened that it's difficult for them to structure political conflict in a way that helps to resolve the inevitable disputes that arise from foreign policy, budgetary policy, and just trying to keep the trains running. So we do see in some cases when leaders try to step down from power, they try to buttress other institutions, but institutions take a long time to build. It's not something that can be done, in short order. So, Putin, I don't know whether he'll stay in power after 2024. It seems fairly likely. Seems to me that were he to want to step down, the economy would have to be doing well. He would have to be satisfied and institutions were in place that would protect him. That there would have to be a successor that people could kind of more or less agree on among the elite. I don't see those three things happening in the next 3 years. So, my hunch, and it's only a hunch, I've never met the man, don't discuss these issues with him personally, but my hunch is that he's likely he'll stay on in 2024.
Okay, so I have a queue with Joel Hellman and Thane Gustafson here, but I want to invite the online audience. After that, I'll turn to any questions that our online audience have, if any.
Thanks, and I don't want to play into the the Putinology of the current bare-chested horse riding hockey play. Dominant player in this remarkably complex system, but there's something I do want to get your opinion about historical rise of Putin. Because I mean, what maybe students here would not have remembered, and certainly you sort of saw, was that when Putin took power, the state had collapsed. The institutions, the military, KGB, they were taking anything that wasn't bolted to the floor and sort of selling it for for cash. A group of incredibly wealthy, not just wealthy, incredibly wealthy businessmen had created not just Russian business, but international businesses with partnerships in the best companies in the world. And this guy comes out of nowhere, essentially, and it takes what looked like all a failed state. What some scholars suggested was impossible, that winners had taken all and they were doing it. How did this guy, and essentially almost single-handedly reestablish what he called the power vertical in a place, because we so rarely sort of see states that are collapsing reestablish themselves. So not to over mythologize his power, but how did he rebuild this?
Yeah, no, so it's great. It was great fun to go back to the early, Putin period in the late 1990s and look at some of the predictions about how the oligarchs are going to eat Putin for lunch. The regional governors, who've been active in electoral politics, are really gonna wipe out this bureaucrat who was short, who people didn't know, who looked uncomfortable in public speaking. All this Putin swagger is something that he really developed over time. This was not something that came naturally to him. If you look at the early 2000s, it's a very different Putin than what we've come to see. So how is Putin able to do this? Well, it helped. The timing was important in that the massive increase in energy prices and a taxation regime that suddenly, filled government coffers in a way that, was just unthinkable in the 1990s when oil prices were at historic lows. One of the reasons why Russia defaults in 1998 is because of the Thai baht, not because of anything that happens in Russia. We have a run on currencies in Southeast Asia, economic growth collapse, oil prices collapse, and the government is just unable to pay its debts. And we've got, real government collapse, just in the way that Dean Hellman describes. Apart from this massive increase, this massive infusion of capital into the Russian government, was also a consensus that the Russian state needed rebuilding, right? We forget the first 3 years when Putin comes to power, the liberals are completely on board with his economic policy. It's all about cutting red tape. It's all about reducing corruption. It's about pension reform and banking reform. And, there was a consensus from, Solzhenitsyn to Gaidar that the state needed to be strengthened. Now, I think what a lot of people didn't realize that the state was going to be strengthened, a lot more than they anticipated. But one other factor I think that's important, and this I think comes from the cross-national literature as well, is that Putin didn't face any strong institutions that were like a strong military or a strong party that he had to bargain with for power. So Putin could deal with the oligarchs individually. He could deal with the governors individually, rather than having to deal with them as an organization. An organization might have some leverage over a new leader, but Putin was really adept, even early on, at playing the governors off against each other, playing the oligarchs against each other. So facing these weak institutions, that I think helped facilitate his ability to really concentrate power. Now, also, the state has become much stronger, but the power of vertical is also kind of a creaky beast in a lot of ways, as we've seen, particularly over the last decade. So, we also don't want to overstate the extent to which Putin concentrates power, makes the trains run on time, and everything works out. Now, a state that's so strong creates its own problems about encouraging either domestic or foreign investment, given the high risk of expropriation. So, a strong state is not a solution in and of itself.
Thank you. Dan.
Yeah, it's been suggested that now that we are facing this very worrisome epidemic of ransomware attacks, cybersecurity attacks, whatnot, it's been suggested that Putin does not actually control this thing, that it's a hydra-headed monster, that it's grown out of control as a kind of a subsidiary of the bureaucracy. Would you agree that this is an example, a good example of what you mean by the weak strongman?
Yeah. Yes.
If it's true.
Yeah, I mean, yes, conditional on it being true. This is the kind of thing that running country that stretches across 11 time zones. Putin can't resolve every problem. He can't every pothole in Omsk is not something that Putin can decide. And the security service is a notoriously opaque organization with all kinds of relationships, not just within the state, but outside the state, right? And to the extent that the Putin administration relies not just on a creaky bureaucracy, but also on contractors who are another step removed from this creaky bureaucracy. It's hard. That's a really difficult management problem to solve. If we think about Putin as the principal, the bureaucracy as the agent, and then you have these talented cyber hackers out there who have some nebulous relation to the security services. That's a pretty difficult thing to control. Also, access to Putin during the COVID pandemic has dramatically narrowed. You have to quarantine before you meet with him. You go through a whole variety of tests, and there's a lot of discussion. It's hard to know what to make of it. That he's probably not likely as well informed as he would be if he were meeting regularly with a much broader group of individuals. So that's speculation, but it's probably not too implausible that the ransomware attacks in particular don't really seem to be something that would directly rebound to the Kremlin's benefit, and actually is one of the topics that's front and center in these ongoing negotiations that are taking place between the White House and the Kremlin.
Okay, I have a question here from a member of the online audience, Dasul Kim. It's about Russian particularism within the spectrum of personalist autocracy. He says, thank you for your explanation of the book. I agree that Russia can be understood as one authoritarian regime and not as a unique case, but there still seem to be many differences. What aspects of Russia should we focus on to make generalizations using the Russian case? What is the biggest difference between the Russian case and other forms of personalist?
Yes, that's great. I'm glad for that question because all countries are unique, right? That's just the way things are. But what we want to try to identify is some logic in the political system that is common that helps us understand things that we didn't, see initially, or things that, might seem unique, but then we see them repeated elsewhere. And I think in domestic politics, autocrats have to deal with this trade-off about censorship. If you censor too much, then you also don't get needed information that's helpful in running the economy and running society. It's manipulating elections, another kind of common problem. In foreign policy, though, particularly with the Russian case, Russia is not a usual actor in foreign policy. And for me, that was a difficult chapter to write. And I specifically kind of disavow the large literature on comparative foreign policy of autocracy, in part because Russia is a different beast than most other autocracies in its foreign policy. But there are a couple of ways that even in foreign policy, I think it's helpful to think of these difficult trade-offs. One is anti-Westernism. Now, we know Russia has a long tradition of trying to be part of the West, but also be distinct from the West. And at various points, there's been emphasis on anti-Westernism, and other points less so. But one thing we see in a lot of these personalist autocracies is the anti-Westernism, particularly when the economy's not doing well or when things are otherwise going badly. And I quote, there's some quotes from Orban about how the West has raped Hungary. There's quotes from Duterte about how the Western powers would do their destruction of the Philippines. Turkey as well, trying to say that we're distinct from them. In this way, that this is kind of a common pattern we see in a lot of these personalist autocracies. The other one that I think is interesting is this trade-off between Russia's really assertive foreign policy, which makes it difficult for Putin to attain his other goal, which is to develop Russia's economy, right? So the very groups who are helped by this assertive foreign policy are those groups that are benefiting from the economic status quo and that want to keep an unlevel playing field to reduce foreign competition, to keep subsidies going, because it's beneficial to them. So over the long run, Putin has this choice to make. You can keep doing the assertive foreign policy, but that comes at the cost of slow growth. And this is apart even from the economic sanctions, I think. It's really a choice about whether you want to try to make Russia more efficient or whether you want to keep having a more assertive foreign policy. So those kinds of trade-offs, I think, are a useful way to think about this problem.
Shades of Alfred J. Weber's famous essay on persistent factors. There are 5 core dilemmas, and when you address one, you exacerbate the others.
That's exactly, and I think often when we focus so much on Putin, we forget that he's part of this broader system and has to be making these bargains that are difficult to enforce and difficult to construct.
But what you said about the West also, it's not just that we whip up anti-Western hatred, but there's also this love-hate relationship, and underneath the kind of animosity, there's this fascination, and one could perhaps say that this is particularly intense and long-lasting in Russia, and I think that may affect your prognosis for sort of post-Putin, because there's always been these cycles of reform and reaction.
No, that's exactly right. So if you look at kind of attitudes towards the US over the last 30 years, I don't think there's evidence of a kind of deep-seated kind of anti-Westernism. You see fluctuations, it's generally positive. And when there are big jumps or big declines, they're pretty explainable. You get, when relations are good, you get a more positive view of the US. After Crimea, they go way down. They sneak back up for about the next 5 or 6 years. And then recently in the last, 18 months or so, they've started to trickle back down again. But they're still in the range of, 40% approve, 40% disapprove, and, 20% don't know and don't care. So, the sense that there is, kind of, uniquely Russian anti-Western sentiment that is just waiting, that's latent and waiting to be untapped, I don't think is really borne out by the evidence, particularly among the younger generation, for whom the anti-Western is much less effective tool.
We're coming to the end of our time, but since we started late, we can have one more question, please.
We have two more.
Two more.
Very quick question, if I'm not hogging the floor, maybe you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just want to, and if you covered it earlier, just let me know, I'll up the video. But why didn't Putin in the 2000s, as he was coming up, attain the type of appointment or replacement power over the oligarchs that, say, Xi Jinping has over the Politburo members?
Yeah, well, I mean, Xi Jinping has a party, right? This is a key distinction. Putin doesn't have a party. He only in this most recent election did Putin really kind of put his shoulder to the wheel to try to buck up United Russia. There's always been, that's Medvedev or Shoigu, or we'll put somebody else really involved with that. Putin will from time to time say, good things about United Russia, but he also, recognizes that there's a big gap between the approval of Putin and the approval of United Russia, right? So he doesn't want to, risk his political capital on United Russia, and also because they're a good scapegoat. Things go badly, well, that's the government and that's United Russia. It's not really Putin. So in that way, it's a very different decision making. Although, to the extent that Xi is now taking more power into his own hand and getting rid of term limits, it's this China's becoming more of a one-party personalist hybrid rather than the pure kind of one-party regime it was prior to Xi.
But before thing, can I just ask a couple of things final? Because the remarkable thing is, can you tell us something more about the extent of repression? Because that prevents opposition. Because obviously, in comparison to China, which has a deep communist party structure that monitors, potential oppression for opposition, squashes it. The Soviet capacity to monitor through the party, through little bobs, in every hotel floor, all that's collapsed. And remarkable. I mean, we know about the high-profile Peter Navalny and and the killings and murders, but there's still, it's almost hand-to-hand, one-on-one.
Yeah.
How in a country that big, how do you make? Is there a deeper wellspring of repression that we don't see?
So, I mean, on the other hand, even with trust in Putin going down from when you ask Russians in an open question, name 5 politicians you trust. 2018, 60% said Putin. Now about a third say Putin. Approval ratings are still fairly high. So there is still a kind of base of support in Russia for Putin and Putinism. And there is still a social base. And I think from the opposition's point of view, that that's not going anywhere. And the risks of engaging in open political activity, given the unlikelihood of success, makes repression remarkably effective, and that has this multiplier effect. That why bother? Like, I think that's the sentiment is, we're not happy. We'll put some skin in the game to try to change politics, but we're not crazy, right? We're not going to take on a regime that still has a big social base and whose repressive capacity is increasing dramatically. And again, this is taking place during COVID as well. It's also taking place at a time when other models of governance, like advanced democracies, are much less attractive form than they used to be. And Putin is very successful at saying, oh, look, January 6th in Washington. You want democracy? Well, that's what democracy is. We don't have that here in Russia. We're stable, right? So, it's a multitude of these factors.
Just a quick follow-on comment on Joel's point, and then a quick question, if I may. You don't need a network of informers anymore. The softwares developed by Facebook and Google will take care of that for you. Alexa is listening to your every word. So
Alexei.
the but the practical problem is that someone's got to listen to all that good stuff that you're picking up. And we don't see the army of listeners, do we? So on the quick question, apart from your own book, which is the best of the Putin books to date?
Oh my gosh, it could take a long time. But at the risk of offending some of my colleagues and not mentioning them, I love Josh Yoffe's book. I think that's just a terrific book. And like this book,
The
it's
Why the Men.
yes. Between two two fires, yes.
Right.
Like my book, it's not really a Putin book in the sense of a biography that says, if we understand Putin, then we understand Russia, or Putin is this historic figure and we need to understand him. And he just does a remarkable job of telling the stories of ordinary Russians trying to make these difficult trade-offs between staying true to their principles, but also recognizing that if they want to get things done, they have to make compromises. And he describes a range of people who are successful at this, who fail at this, who throw away their lives, by cooperating in a kind of overly aggressive way with the regime. And I think that is one of my that is really one of my favorite books. I should add, he blurbed my book, so this is not a kind of quid pro quo, but it is really a terrific one.
And he's a Georgetown grad.
And he's a Georgetown grad.
Is there a book in Russian? I mean, is it in Russian language, given the strong capacity in Russia? Is there anyone who's written about Putin in Russian that is really worth reading here? And making
In
notes?
recent, Vladimir Gelman's work is really, what is it, Authoritarian Russia, which has the best introduction to a book ever written. Just buy the book, read the introduction, and you've got your money's worth. So I'll put in a plug for Vladimir Gelman's Authoritarian Russia. He's in Finland, yes. But his book on bad governance, about how bad governance is good politics, that's written
Yes, that's true.
in Russia. Some journalistic accounts of Putin, are available. Recent years though, it's pretty slim pickings. It's more the earlier period.
Tim, it's been such a pleasure to have you here. As a minor oligarch once told me, our gates are always open.
Thank you. It's been terrific.